I'm Kristen DiCerbo. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy. What does a Chief Learning Officer do? It definitely depends on what organization you're in. At Khan Academy, I lead our content team. So that's the team that works on all of the exercises that we write, all of the articles, works with Sal on videos, creates some of our own videos. So the content team, our product management and design teams, which are the teams that work most closely with the engineering team to build the whole experience that students and teachers see when they go to Khan Academy. I also lead our assessment and our community support teams. My background's in educational psychology. I have a PhD in educational psychology from Arizona State. I worked for a little bit of time as a school psychologist in schools in the Phoenix, Arizona area where I am based. But I've spent about 20 years developing, designing, and researching digital learning and assessment environments. So have been for a long time thinking about how can we embed what we know about how people learn into the design of digital environments to help support learners. And as part of that, thinking about teachers and how we can build and tools for teachers to help them uh, be able to both, work more closely with students and to be able to help them help students. So with that, Khan Academy, I don't always like to assume that everyone knows who Khan Academy is. We are an online instruction and practice. We have a mission to provide a free world-class education to anyone, anywhere. Our content is always free to teachers and students to learn from. We have about 12 million learners a month who visit Khan Academy. And as we'll talk about, we have quite a number of different kinds of studies that we do to be able to understand what's driving learning on the platform. Are students who use Khan Academy learning more? How do we make sure that we are designing Khan Academy with those things in mind? So I'm going to start off talking about some of that research, and then I'm going to do a little bit at the end talking about some of the big things we've done with artificial intelligence in the past year and how we're thinking about understanding learning outcomes from that work as well. Please do go ahead and drop questions in if you'd like to. Let's talk a little bit about how we think about efficacy. So one of the big things that we think about in does Khan Academy work is thinking about does it show change on some external measure of assessment? I know you all are in higher education. A lot of this work is done within the K-12 world, in part because there are standardized external measures that are widely available and used in the K-12 world. And so that helps us then, it gives us a measure for us to use as that dependent variable in our research. So with that said, we don't have necessarily the quantitative evidence in higher ed that we see here, but I don't have a lot of reasons to think that if students are using Khan Academy in these same ways at these same levels of usage, they would be seeing similar results. But I think it's also hopefully you find it interesting just to see how we think about working through this. So first, a little bit of background. At Khan Academy, we have a couple of different ways that students interact with our content. First, we have just independent learners, students that are at home or in school or wherever they are, maybe doing their homework, they're stuck on something, they're trying to figure it out. They come and they search for Khan Academy, they maybe watch a video, they maybe do a couple of problems of practice, and then they go back to their homework. So that's our independent learners. We also have district engagements and classroom engagements. So we have teachers who just on their own decide for their class that they would like to use Khan Academy. And so they are able to sign up their class, get reports, be able to assign things to their students, get then feedback back on how those students are doing, all of those things. And then on the district side, we know that often districts will want to use Khan Academy, and they will then work through Khan Academy and say, we also want professional learning for our teachers. We'd like some district level reporting. We'd like to be able to have automatic rostering. So every teacher doesn't have to enter their student's name. They can work from their student information systems to be able to automatically roster their classes and students on Khan Academy. Within that district program, there's also the ability to link Khan Academy to a commonly given assessment in K-12. So this assessment is called MAP Growth, and it's given in many schools 3 times a year, fall, winter, and spring. And if a student is in MAP Accelerator, we can import their scores on those assessments each time they take them and create a path through the Khan Academy material based on their scores. We call that Map Accelerator. So that's the one of the pieces that we have. And because we have those external assessment scores that are part of the program, it also makes it easier for us to be able to conduct research studies. So we have conducted efficacy research with several hundreds of thousands of students for the 2020-21 school year, the 2021-22 school year, and the 22-23 school year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those studies look like. So the first piece that is really fundamentally important here is thinking about usage. And so we know that across educational technology solutions, usage is actually a major issue. So as we're going to talk about, we'll see all of these pieces about, students who use it this much see these kinds of gains. So the first thing to understand is what that looks like. So in our 3 years of study, as you can see, we don't have, of all of the students, all of those 12 million students a month who come to Khan Academy, about 5% of them get to 30 minutes a week of usage, which is not a lot, 30 minutes a week. But if what we have that as a piece that we look at that number, because it's what we will see, we know drives improved learning outcomes. But the key to think about here, and as we'll see, is there are about 48% of students that are between 1 and 9 hours of usage over a year, about 15% 9 to 18 hours, and about 9% doing 18 hours total in our most recent study of the 22-23 school year. So what we see is there's a lot of work to be done just on having students using these practice tools enough to be able to get the benefit from them. Because we know that as we have started looking at what are some of the things that drive student usage, well, in our district's program, what we see is that there are things that teachers and school districts do that drive that usage. So one, if teachers and districts have clear goals that Khan Academy is helping them achieve, that's a big piece. If there are folks within the school district that are supporting the implementation in the school, that then leads to more usage. If folks are looking at the data, so there's data that comes in that teachers can look at and administrators can look at. We know folks that are looking at that data, that those teachers have students that are using Khan Academy more and what that looks like. We also look at professional learning, having support for how this is implemented, communication from district leaders to teachers to students about expectations and how it's used, and then setting aside time or making it clear when students are supposed to be practicing on Khan Academy is another big generalizer. I realize that some of these are going to apply less in the higher ed space, but these are some of the things we see in the K-12 space, where it turns out that the biggest driver of teachers using it is district administrator support, and in school teacher administrator support. And the biggest driver of what students do is what teachers are asking them to do as well. So that piece is probably not surprising. You probably see in higher ed, a lot of students are doing what their professors ask them to do and not more, not extra things on top of that. And so there's some interesting things about how frequently and the number of active weeks students are using it, the number of days active per week. I'm going to kind of, in the interest of time, move through this, but the takeaways here are that we see on average the students in that highest usage group tend to be using Khan Academy in that if you look at that third group of graphs, days per active week, about 3 days per week. And then a fourth, about 20 minutes per each of those times they're using it. So we're not talking about screen time, being on screens all the time. 3 times per week, 20 minutes per time per usage, is what we're looking at for that kind of average use of that highest group. Because here's kind of the big slide to think about. This slide shows for grades 3 through 8 the relationship on the x-axis between the amount of usage and their fall to spring gain on that map growth test. So the red lines you see here are the average gain for all the students who take this test. So what we see on those students that are at the 30 minutes a week, you can see that they are increasing their score from the fall to the spring significantly more than the average growth. So we're seeing greater than norm growth for these students that are spending 30 minutes a week practicing with Khan Academy. Even this 15 to 29 group sees usually in most grades some growth, but it's clearly this group here that's getting the more than expected growth that we would see. So does this hold across different demographic groups is the next question. So we see that this is the average, that 28% growth for that 30 minutes per week group. We see that as we look across what these groups are, it holds for both males and females. It holds for various ethnic groups, and with Black students, it actually is a little higher, so that if you're spending 30 minutes a week, you're actually seeing even more growth that we see there. We see that across, this is the school free and reduced lunch level, which is a common way in schools of measuring socioeconomic status. We do see here that students with low free and reduced lunch, that means they actually have higher economic status, socioeconomic status, because there's fewer percent of students that are getting free and reduced lunch. They're actually having slightly lower gains than students in higher or who are in lower socioeconomic classes. We do see some difference in English language learner populations. So if students who have schools that have low populations of English language learners do see a little bit higher gains, but the error bars here are overlapping. So it's not a significant difference, but there is a little bit. And part of this, as we dove into it, we have content at Khan Academy in 50 languages that is localized, but schools don't tend to point students towards it. So looking at this data was a push for us to think about how do we help schools remember that there is content in 50 languages and help point students towards it. So that's a piece that we're looking at. If you are a researcher and you think about effect sizes and what that means, the differentiation in the growth scores between the group that uses it 30 minutes a week and the group that uses it only 1 to 9 minutes a week is 0.36. So in education, we're pretty happy with that as a amount of growth that we're seeing. And we don't do the comparison to the no use group because we figure we believe that no use group has lots of different factors going on that may make them fairly different than our high use group. So we have folks that at least have gotten on one time and compare them to the students that are using it frequently. So that's part of it, but you may be thinking like, there's still more. Hang on, I'm going to walk through these here. There's still more that we think about. Well, maybe those students that are using it that much are just those self-motivated students, and that's why we're seeing the gains that we're seeing. Well, the good thing is that we now have about 100,000 students that we have multiple years of scores with. So we can then look at how does the same student who maybe uses it a lot one year because their teacher's encouraging it and doesn't use it as much in the next year, how does their growth change? Because so we're just comparing a student to a student. So if they were a highly motivated student, they would probably be doing the same or similar each year. And what does that look like? So when we look at these comparisons, we first see that the majority of students actually do change their amount of usage between the 2 years. So we actually do have a good comparison. We have about 49% of the sample increased their use from year one to year two, about 36% decreased it from year one to year two, and we've got about 15% that didn't really have a meaningful change from year one to year two. So, what happens if we look at the change in usage? If there's no change, they're here at zero. If they used it less, they're on the right. And if they used it more, they're on the right. So, here is I used it less in year two. Here's I used it more. Here's their change in growth. So positive numbers mean they had more growth, negative numbers, less growth. I think that the trend here is pretty clear. If students who used it less had less growth, students who used it more had more growth. But the big piece here is that we're trying to control for individual student interactions. And so by doing that, we've made sure that students aren't that it's not that the explanation for the growth isn't just because more motivated students are using it more. When those same students use it less, they see less growth. And when those students who didn't use it very much one year use it more the next year, then they see more growth in what they're doing. So again, we're trying to start eliminating competing explanations for student outcome results here and what they're doing. Um, so we also are able to actually look at for each individual hour you use Khan Academy, how much growth might you see in that growth index on that assessment. And so we can see for each hour you get about a 0.02 change in effect size. So again, it's that idea of, well, even if you use it 9 hours, on average, you would get about a 0.18 effect size. If you're changing by 18 hours, you get to that 0.33 effect size that we see, because there seems to be a relatively linear relationship. And again, we see that that estimate is pretty similar across gender, ethnicity, free and reduced lunch levels, and levels of English language learning. All right, next. What about the kind of gold standard of research? What about thinking about a randomized control trial where we actually assign classes and this then starts to get at teacher effects? And what does that look like? So there is a researcher at the University of Toronto named Phil Oriopoulos, and he, as a third party, conducted this research, did it with a district in Arlington, Texas. He again went to grade 3 through 8 teachers, uh, put out the call of who wants to be part of this computer assisted learning program, and got a about 224 teachers responded. 112 of them were randomly assigned to a Khan Academy condition. 112 were assigned to a condition that was going to start 1 year later. So that is about 10,900 students. The research team also developed professional learning for teachers, and also had graduate students at the university act as coaches. We put a K in front of things for Khan Academy coaches. Coaches who were supporting, doing technical support as needed for the teachers, helping the teachers look at their data, and do that kind of work. There were two kinds of schools here. There's elementary schools and middle schools. The elementary schools had a 70-minute math block each day and an additional weekly enrichment period that the teachers could use for whatever they wanted. The middle schools had 50 minutes of math blocks each day and no additional flexibility. I'm telling you that because this is foreshadowing of results that we're going to see in a minute. The dependent variable here is the Texas state exam. So the Texas STAR test is what they call that in Texas. And so there are two kinds of analysis you can do with when you randomly assign people. So there's 112 teachers in that group that we said, you have Khan Academy. Some of them used it and some of them did not. So the intent to treat analysis includes everyone who is in that group, whether they used it or not, and compares them to the group that didn't use it. So you can imagine those teachers that didn't use it, we might not expect to see as much growth, and they're going to be kind of dragging down the average there, but maybe they were doing things on their own anyway. But because of random assignment, they should be doing the same things as the teachers, seeing similar results to teachers that weren't using it. The other kind of analysis we can do is we can look at the teachers who actually did use it and compare those then to the teachers that were in the control group. And what we see is that in the elementary school, we have a significant, although smaller, positive effect on the intent to treat analysis, which means we've got everyone who is able to use it. Some of teachers weren't using it at all, but we still saw about a 0.12 effect size. In the middle school, we saw a non-significant effect. And again, they had that 50 minutes of time. What we saw in the quasi-experimental, when we looked at the folks who actually used it, we do see that classes who spent more time had higher star scores, and our effect sizes are, around 0.24. And when you look at about 35 minutes of practice a week, what did those high practice teachers do? They said, yes, I think I buy into this program. I'm going to commit to using this program. They had specific time set aside for it. They used incentive for students and they monitored the data. And those were the things that we saw that then led to the improved then student usage and student outcomes for teachers. All right, I'm going to bring one more piece into this because it's going to then lead into some of the AI work we do as well. When we have to rely on these external assessments, it makes it difficult for us to, we don't get any results until the end of the year. And it's not even the end of the year. These scores aren't released until often the following fall. So it's really difficult for us to start, if we release a new feature or we change something, to understand, like, is this improving what we have? And so what we'd like to develop is an internal measure, a measure based on what students do on our platform that we know is correlated to those external measures, but that we can use both to get faster understanding of whether things were changing or helping students learn, and also help us measure things where there isn't an external assessment that's easily available, including with higher ed folks. So this internal learning metric that we've been thinking about, the idea is we want something that's easily monitored and tracked using data from Khan Academy's platform, that it's validated against an external measure of learning, and that it's understandable by everyone. So we could create a really complex measure that's a mix of a bunch of different pieces of data we see on our site that we use, a regression analysis, and combine all of that data, but it would be really hard to understand what are we actually measuring. So we were looking for something that also makes sense to people. And what we have landed on is what we call skills to proficient. So on Khan Academy, when you work on any particular skill, you move on that skill from attempted to familiar to proficient to mastered as you get more and more questions right. And so what we can count the number of skills a student has leveled up on to that proficient status. And we find that that number is highly correlated to that MAP growth index. So you see on the graph here on the right, if you level up less than 16 skills to proficient, 16 to 26, et cetera, these different buckets, you can see the change in that growth index. So the more skills you mastered, the more growth that we are seeing from fall to winter. So this starts to tell us, hey, there's something here. If we use this measure of getting more skills to proficient, that's something that we can clearly try to get students to do more of. And we know that it shows us a relationship to external measures of growth too. Then we said, well, is it is it really skills to proficient? What is the difference between getting a bigger number of skills to familiar? Like, what if I could get 60 skills to familiar? Would that be better or worse than getting 45 skills to proficient? Like, should I go broad or should I go deep? And the data is actually fairly clear. It takes a minute to unpack what's going on this graph. Um, but essentially, the different colors are the different levels up. So let's take this middle section here. Everyone in this section leveled up on 30 skills. So that means 30 skills moved at least up one level, attempted to familiar, maybe familiar to proficient. The colors mean that of those 30 skills, pink means all of them were leveled up to familiar. The dark green means they were all leveled up to proficient. And so what we can start to see here on the difference is leveling up to proficient on 30 skills gives you more growth than leveling up to just familiar on half your skills, even if you do that on 50 skills. And the same thing with familiar to proficient. So leveling up to proficient, even on fewer number of skills, is better than just getting to familiar on a greater number of skills. And this is totally in line, if you're familiar with mastery learning, this is totally aligned with that research. That research tells us we want students generally to get to at least 80% 80% scores on a traditional, percent-based test, even better 90. And if they do that, they're then able to use that skill in another environment, whether that be an end of the year test or another kind of situation that calls on them to use that skill. That we need to get to that high level of achievement on that skill for it to then be transferable. So it's not surprising, but it's good to see that confirmed in data. Like, it's actually better to keep working on that skill and getting it really to that level of proficiency than to say, I kind of got it. I've got about, I can get 60% of questions right on it. And I'm going to go ahead and now move on to another skill and what that looks like. So that is a lot of what our platform is based on, is this idea of promoting mastery learning, promoting getting skills to proficient. And before you're continuing to move on to other skills, particularly in math, where skills build on each other, if you've got that shaky foundation, you're going to be struggling. And I'm sure anyone here who teaches math at higher ed bemoans the lack of some of the basic skills that students coming into their classrooms don't have. And because they've never actually had to get to some level of proficiency or mastery on those skills. So that's a little bit about how we track those and what that looks like. All right, I'm gonna step out of here for a minute and go to our website. In March of 2023, we launched what we call Khanmigo. Khanmigo is an AI-powered assistant for teachers and a tutor for students. So for teachers, we have actually, if you sign up for Khan Academy on the Khan Academy site as a teacher, you have free access to all of our teacher tools. And so what you see on teacher tools, let me pause and see, am I showing the Khan Academy website, or are you still seeing the slides?
Khan Academy website in a smaller version.
Okay, all right. Let me give you increase the size. Hopefully you can see a little better. So these are some of the teacher activities. When we launched in 2023, we started this with actually, I think 5 activities. And as soon as we started talking to some K-12 teachers, they've said things like, ooh, could it help me write a rubric? Writing rubrics is so hard to figure out what should be a 2 or a 3, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a rubric generator. We have a lesson plan creator, which again is more of a K-12 thing. Things like discussion prompts. How can I help me think of some really engaging discussion prompts? Lesson hooks. What am I going to do in that first 5 minutes that's going to grab attention, introduce the topic, spark curiosity, and maybe activate prior knowledge? So teachers can go in and think about, hey, how can I do a lesson hook? exit tickets. What is something I can ask at the end of class to see if students have really gotten the point of the lesson and what those look like? Writing letters of recommendation, helping draft some of those things. So these tools are all available for teachers and what they're doing. And then if we go to some of our classes, I'm going to go to Algebra 1 just because it's one of our more, it is our most popular class. And I go to, I'm going to do equations with variables on both sides here. This is what students see, although I'm actually in teacher mode right now. And so if you're doing practice on Khan Academy, and I'm going to move into student mode here, and I'm working on this problem as a student, I can then say, help me solve this, try a similar example. Why should I care about learning this? I can just say, I'm stuck. So if I type that in, what's happening now is we are sending that student's message along with the problem they're working on, the answer to that problem, our hint structure to OpenAI's GPT 4.0 model right now. And we're also sending about a set of instructions on how to act like a tutor. So if you just put this piece into ChatGPT, this question, ChatGPT will work through all the steps and give you the answer. We have designed a system that is not about giving you the answer. It's about helping students get to the answer. And so let's work through this together. What do you notice about the terms on each side of the equation? 16 minus 2t equals t plus 9 plus 4t. Can you identify any like terms that we can combine? What's a like term? And so it will walk students through thinking through how to work through problems with them as a tutor. So it gives a little expression. Hang on, I'm going to do one more thing. Can you just give me the answer? Again, we've built in some of these pieces here on working on this. So this is the math side. It says, oh, I can't give you the answer, but I'm here to help you figure it out. Let's focus on combining like terms first. So that's a little bit of what happens if students are working on on Khan Academy content. If they are working on other content, so they're working on outside homework, they can also bring their own questions. So if I just go to Tutor Me Math and Science, um, first, there's some warnings. This is an AI, so we want to warn students that this is an experimental activity. I can make mistakes, but they can say, I want some help on a particular question and type it in, and it'll act the same way it does with Khan Academy's content and helps walk them through that and get the answer. The final piece I'm going to show, apart from math, we also think there's an opportunity in writing. And when we think about writing, we know that I know when you assign an essay, you end up with a huge stack of grading to do, and you're working through all of that, giving students feedback on their writing, feedback on drafts often, feedback on outlines, hugely time consuming. And we know that if students don't get feedback for a week, they start to, particularly on that final, they kind of look at the grade on the back and then put it away. So they're not getting that immediate feedback either. We have developed a tool. It does not grade, but it does provide students feedback. So it starts with just the assignment that's here. This is an assignment for a 10th grader to write a persuasive or argumentative essay about whether leisure time is better scheduled or unscheduled. So students can first type, and ask Khanmigo, like, what is an argumentative essay? Work through and ask some questions about the assignment itself. They can then move into outlining, where I'm showing you this. This is a little bit like on cooking shows where they give you oh, look, here, it's already done. I filled in some of this so you don't have to watch me fill it in. So as we think about, should leisure time be scheduled? Okay, my thesis is going to be that leisure time should be scheduled. All right, what are my main points? What is my evidence? So the students can start filling in here their outline. They can then draft their response. But I think one of the key things here is this revising piece. So here's my essay. I've written it. I can now, Khanmigo will review this. And what's happened is we have given Khanmigo the instructions of what should the introduction do? What kind of feedback should students get about an introduction? about evidence and reasoning, about structure, about their conclusion, and about their style and tone. And so for each of these, Khanmigo's reviewed it. And so let's look, here's the introduction. It said, to make your introduction even stronger, consider providing some context or background information on the topic of scheduled versus unscheduled leisure. This will help the reader understand why the topic is significant. It has also made the suggestion of, while your thesis statement is clear and it's underlined, the thesis statement, it could be more engaging, considering use more compelling language to draw your reader in and make them more interested in your argument. Now I can ask it to give an example, to explain, I can revise it and ask it to check it or to ask a question. Same thing here. I've been chatting with it about making this language even stronger and asked it to give me an example. And it said, sure, it's going to give me an example from a different essay, not from this essay, so that climate change is a pressing issue. And then it's revising it, showing how it's giving more context so that the student can see an example of less context and more context, and then potentially use it themselves. The other piece around this is that all of this interaction is stored in a student chat history. And that if the class is set up with a teacher and a student, that chat history is available for the teacher. So the teacher can also see, what is the student doing? What is Khanmigo suggested? What are they suggesting and not doing? So it also starts to address some of that idea of, how is AI just going to write all of the students' essays from here on out? How do we understand who's using AI and who's not, and what kinds of things they're doing? How do we help students start thinking about preparing for AI, using AI tools appropriately, understanding when they should be used and not? That's a huge conversation, but we think we are providing some of the tools to at least allow some transparency in terms of what's going on with student writing and what they're doing. So do these, let's talk about outcomes. Do these tools help? Do they work? So as I said, we launched these in March of 23. We have then spent the last year doing a lot of qualitative research. We've interviewed students and teachers. We've observed in classrooms, because the first question was, are we providing tools that are useful to students and teachers? Are they using them? Before we can get into the, does then the use help students learn? We want to make sure we're doing this. We've done a lot of revisions. Like I said, this essay tool has just actually launched this summer. Well, we had an essay feedback tool that launched in November, and now that was just about drafting and revising, and now we've pulled the whole thing together based on what we heard from teachers and students. So what we found was that students did appreciate the helping them get unstuck when they're stuck and they don't have anyone around to ask on the tutoring capabilities. We also found that English language learners in particular, Khanmigo officially supports Spanish and Portuguese, but also if you type in most other languages, it will give you some response in that language. And a lot of English language learners told us it was really helpful. They're sometimes embarrassed to ask lots of questions of their teachers, and they can ask questions of Khanmigo and get responses to help them understand in their home language, which I think we weren't necessarily designing and expecting that, but it was interesting to learn. We also found that interacting with AI is not just a natural skill, and both teachers and students need just the opportunity to play around with it and practice and see what it can do. Learn that it's not always going to give you what you want on the first try, but for example, on some of those teacher tools, if you then ask it, oh, that's not quite what I want, can you make it more this? Can you make it less this? It'll revise it. So it's more like working with an assistant or an intern, and learning how to do that is a little bit of a skill that takes some time to practice and learn. And we saw that with teachers. If teachers had a professional learning opportunity, they tended to be better users and work through it. So that's a little bit of what we've learned, and it's set us up now this year to be able to really start to look at, do students that are using these tools get to, for example, more skills to proficient? Does it facilitate more, getting more students to practice more? Does it increase that engagement? Do we start to see more than 9% of our learners getting to that active use that we're looking for, and that we'd like to see? So those are some of the things we're starting to measure this year as we've started the new school year and what we've gotten into. I'm
That,
going to
that,
stop there.
Dr. DiCerbo, thank you for your wonderful insights. A quick question. Um, AI is powerful providing individual learning tool, right? Especially with tutoring. One question that I have for you is, how can we ensure that students becoming active agents in their own learning? And then the second question would be, how can we foster true ownership of their learning experience, especially with this tutoring mechanism, AI?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things about student agency and develop students being owners of their own learning. Um, I think that students need to be coached in that and learn how to learn. It's not the case that if we just let students make their own choices, that they're going to make the right choices. Students, learning is hard. Learning takes cognitive effort. I just saw a meta-analysis the other day that found that across many, many studies, there's a significant correlation between putting forth cognitive effort and negative emotions. Like, it just feels bad sometimes to have to keep working on something that's hard and doing that. So I think the first thing we need to do is to give students the scaffolds and the help that they need, to be successful, and then to gradually remove those as they become more proficient. So we need to recognize, when's a student a novice who really is struggling with this content and needs help to do it, and when are the students then have more understanding, more proficiency with the content, and we should be removing that help and scaffolds and making it so we are more doing the motivation and engagement to do things on their own and to make their own choices, as opposed to relying on the scaffolds and the help. So I think a lot of this piece about, helping students own it is not expecting them to do it right away when they're novices just learning something, but then gradually giving them more and more responsibility as they progress in their schooling and what they're doing. So that's kind of our first philosophy in thinking through things. We also think a lot with this AI. There's been a lot of discussion with us internally about productive struggle, and the idea of sometimes it's good to struggle, and then you get that aha moment, and that, like, is so rewarding, and we don't want to remove that by giving them so much help that they lose that idea of struggle. So but there's a point at which struggling too much just creates frustration and causes students to shut down and leads to students thinking, I'm just not good at this and I'm not a math person. So it's
Yeah.
that balance of, like, how do we provide enough help and not too much help? Um, we have not come up with the perfect balance of that yet, but that's something that we are continuing to work on. And as we think about, we know we have bunch of data about students that interact on our platform. We can use that to actually help guide how the interactions with Khanmigo work.
Thank you. And it's really good. The AI tutoring, you're not giving the students the answers. You're giving them steps, right? That's
Right.
wonderful. That is
Right.
wonderful. So thank you for that. And Amanda?
Amanda.
Uh, yeah, I'm just responding or relaying a question that Jason had put in the chat, and you touched on many elements of this. So Jason couches it with, it might be off topic, but it's spot on to me. He asks, are there any negative and positive effects when it comes to achieving and learning when you have students who are more independent versus students who parents are being helicoptering, are by students who are being helicoptering by their parents? Sorry.
Yeah. So one of I'll start with a bit of this. So we have actually had teachers tell us, you know what, I'm having students do this work in class because when I send it home, suddenly they know everything and they're getting every question right. Oh, and it's because their parents are sitting over their shoulder, having them do that work. And I think it relates to the last question as well. How do you help students become more independent and work through them? So there's definitely times when it's appropriate to give help and scaffolding, and there's times when that's just going to interfere with students becoming independent learners and being able to master these skills on their own. And so there's definitely downsides to, yes, the having parents that are right there and helping with everything. And it can be tough as an educator to be able to have those conversations with parents. It's tough to even understand first, is that what's going on here? And then starting to think about building it. But I think if you couch that in terms of thinking about building students' autonomy, building their agency, building their ability to become lifelong learners, their parents are probably going to agree that those are goals that we want to achieve, and can be a good way to have some of those conversations.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you, Amanda and Kristen. Yeah, that was my question because I grew up as very independent, and I learned really early in life about grit, about not giving up, and no matter how many times the horse knocks you off the saddle. So, and that really taught me how, especially in life, in the tough times, that you just don't give up. So I see, including me, including our family and other families, that there's kids are being helicoptered. I mean, they don't have any independent, they don't know how to think for themselves. And also everything is given to them. And I think it's really more destroying the student, the child or the student. It's doing big disadvantages because when they grow up as to be adults, and when they do fail, they won't know exactly how to handle it. So
Yeah.
I believe this generation needs more grit, in my opinion. So there's
I
a
was
nice book
just
out about grit.
ah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Angela Duckworth works some with us actually, and has
yeah,
done a lot of work on grit as well. And I think the other piece is letting students fail in low stakes environments, so they become like they understand what that is, so that then when they get to higher stakes environment, that idea of failure isn't so daunting, and that they have built up some of those skills when it doesn't matter as much, and it's okay.
I love that you just highlighted that, because I'm a huge advocate for that, and I'm an instructional designer, and one of the things I'm constantly talking about to my faculty is, if everything is high stakes, when do they have the option to practice and grow from that practice? If we look at sports, we wouldn't expect someone to, walk out into a game and perform at their best without having hours and hours and hours of practice leading up to it. Low stakes feedback. I mean, during that practice, they're still getting criticized, coached, whatever, by that person. But in academia and in our learning environments, we seem to disconnect those opportunities from what we know is sound ways of learning. So I love that you highlighted that, because it's a huge thing missing in higher education, is the opportunity for students to fail and be coached, fail in low stakes ways. So I
Yep,
appreciate that.
absolutely.
Are there any other questions? Or I think we've got a couple more minutes if somebody had last one before we move on to our next speaker.
I see
Yeah.
I'll just pick up this little piece here about whether AI skills are, new competencies that should be developed. What does AI literacy look like? And I see Patricia said they're getting some not insignificant pushback around this. This seems to be an ongoing topic, and I think right now there's not like there aren't clear frameworks of, here are the skills, here's what AI literacy means, here's the competencies, here's the skills. That I've seen a couple different frameworks. Digital Promise has one, but Patricia, to your point, I think it has to continue to be a discussion in whatever community you're in. Like, what does it mean for our community? where do we think, what do we as a community think is important for AI or not, and why not, if folks are thinking that it's not. And we're just in a place where I don't think we should assume that we have agreement or even really understanding of what all of those skills might be.